Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to do part one of what I bet will be 3 parts of a wrap-up video for what I've been reading over the summer. And this is meant to sort of be a random mixture of June, July, and August. But if you're interested about all of the books I read so far, as summer is finally winding down, I always thought in my mind I've read maybe like 20 or so books, but it's been at least 35 apparently. So I'm going to list all of these books down below, and then more specifically the books I'm only talking about for today. But the first book I wanted to talk about was All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews. This is a story about a woman named Yiyun Li and her sister Elfie, and Yiyun Li is a writer and Elfie is this renowned pianist, although Elfie is showing signs or recurring signs of suicidal behavior. Although the focus is always on Yiyun Li herself, even though it does sort of orient around Yiyun Li and Elfie's family, we do know that over time, since they're well into their adulthood, that they've had sort of their own separate lives going on, specifically with Yiyun Li, no doubt dealing with a lot of stress and sadness. She's also recently divorced, and she has kids, but she has a good relationship with them, but it doesn't help either that between Yiyun Li and Elfie themselves, their father also passed to suicide. Somehow Miriam Toews manages to sort of portray this very complex sense of how our emotional peril might actually open us up to love and things like humor. As I found the book itself having this surprise sort of amount of punchy lines that really got at me. But it's interesting because I feel like overall, while I don't think this book is necessarily funny, I do think it opens up to this interesting thought of our emotions and how we deal with compassion specifically. It's compassion that kind of becomes this thread for every character in this book. Whether or not I think sometimes compassion can be expressed through these characters in some selfish ways, like Yiyun Li considering doing a certain request for Elfie that I won't spoil as a way to sort of accommodate for how she couldn't help her father. And within itself, sort of just the fragile nature of compassion and how it can be used. And there are really 2 parts I like in the book where Yiyun Li is yelling at Elfie while she's very immobile in the hospital after again trying to kill herself. And Yiyun Li basically yells at Elfie, and Elfie literally can't do anything. She can't move, but she is conscious. And I think Elfie even starts crying, and Yiyun Li doesn't care, but she's doing it because she loves her. And then a nurse walks in, and then she realizes they were like whispering, Yiyun Li and Elfie, to each other in the dark. So the nurse turns the light on, but then she says, sorry, and then she turns the lights back off. And there are just small moments like that throughout this book that felt really genuine. And going back to humor, I think it's very appropriate as a response given sort of all this sad sort of aura within this book. Because in a way, if you think about it, humor, I think it's one of our emotions that catches us off guard the most, but whether or not we choose to welcome that feeling. I think that's sort of what Miriam Toews is trying to do here. Interestingly, another book I read that I also really liked, and I do think it also talks well into about compassion and also has characters that are writers like Yiyun Li. It is Early Work by Andrew Martin. Early Work follows characters Peter and Leslie, both writers that are just really trying to make it through. I think they're in their early 30s or late 20s. This book also is pretty funny, I would say. Probably the funniest and sharpest and wittiest book I've read in terms of dialogue portraying sort of the mundanity of our sort of self-deprecating humor we have now. Although Peter and Leslie definitely, I wouldn't say, are self-deprecating characters. I think actually they're quite disgusting morally and quite vile, mainly because they're attracted to each other and they are already both in their own separate relationships. But to the extent of sort of wondering about what their motive is, it's really hard to tell, but it's very interesting to sort of unravel as a reader. Peter, to me, seems a bit less forgiving as a character because I think he knows what he's capable of doing. But with Leslie, I think she's the one that really, I think, is the heart of Early Work. Whereas Peter, he does have writing goals, but currently he sort of just feels very aimless. He works at a woman's prison where he teaches writing, which he feels pretty apathetic to. And then later in the book, we do have Leslie ask Peter directly, what do you want to do? And Peter just says, I'll do whatever you want me to do, which feels like the most hopeless and saddest response within that part of the book that really just got at me. Naturally, with this relationship, Peter and Leslie do their best to try keeping it a secret from everybody else. It's really us that gets in on the joke of sort of their relationship. And I say joke because it's so funny to me how Leslie and Peter, they are smart and I think they're capable, but they don't give themselves the moral compass that I think they would give to the characters they would write. Because I think a cliche that a writer would know is sort of that predictability of having this sort of forbidden romance, but Andrew Martin so smartly creates this satire on that sort of cliche that he makes it about Peter and Leslie in that same scheme. We only get Peter's perspective in the beginning, and then we realize it switches back and forth between Peter and Leslie. And whenever Leslie comes in, it's interesting to get her insight because it seems so opposite to sort of how Peter basically manic pixie dreams girls Leslie. Though I think a really great quote in here to sort of summarize Peter and Leslie's feelings is this moment when they're watching this really excessively long Michael Jackson documentary. And Peter goes on to say, "The sadness I felt watching the movie had something to do with the person's art betraying them, of watching a man who has grown bored with the possibilities of his craft attempting to find, somewhere in his past, something worth preserving, and finding nothing." So I feel like Peter and Leslie's fear isn't that they can't be together. I think instead it's about how they're worried about losing their imagination to inspire their writing, and how they know they need each other to sort of compete with each other in that process. The next book I wanted to talk about is my favorite book of 2019 so far, and that is Milkman by Anna Burns. This story takes place in Northern Ireland in the 1970s during the Troubles, and it follows a young woman who's 18 years old who remains unnamed and is constantly harassed by this milkman. If you've heard anything about this book, you've probably heard about its sort of interesting sentence structure and how committed it is to keeping it, but over time I found that the language in this book never felt out of the ordinary. Sure, it felt a bit of an adjustment period to get used to, but I feel like it was all for the sake of sort of propelling the velocity of this story. I will say that the use of language always felt like it had this organic momentum to it. I respect Anna Burns' choice in writing style, but never once did I feel like it was sacrificing the storytelling or anything. There are a lot of think pieces, I'll say, in sort of reviews of Milkman because I feel like there's so much to talk about or interpret, but to me I understood it as in a time where the Troubles were so hostile, that sort of mix of helplessness but also needing to take action or wanting to sort of created this large bubble of anxiety that was about to burst. So I feel like Anna Burns was sort of using her characters, especially without naming, to sort of give that confidence of exploring sort of their innate desires to sort of combat the time that they were living in. And I think this is so well done with our main character orienting herself, especially herself as a woman, and sort of understanding the politics of her body taking up space, and how no matter if you just put it in one room and then take it to another room, people can interpret it so differently, and how you're doing something so politically, maybe subliminally. I also think this is another book that sort of implements humor very well amid its bleakness, and someone correct me if I'm wrong because it's been a while since I read this, but I thought there was this really funny moment where I think it's our protagonist who's in a woman's bathroom, and then these other women come out of their stalls, or at least they're in the bathroom too, and they beat up this man that's in there, and then they say, "We didn't beat him up because of who he is, we beat him up because he's in a woman's restroom and he's not supposed to be in here." So I love that playfulness. There are other characters named the sisters in here that I also enjoyed, but I think Anna Burns is very clever and smart and sharp with how she sort of structured this novel. And I think if anything, it's certainly more about execution that feels rewarding with how she pulls it off versus really any of my relationship with the characters. Another book that I've talked about a few times already within these past couple of months is Amongst Women by John McGahern. I eventually went down this like Irish lit binge of sorts throughout the summer, so with McGahern it's really the starting point for me now that I've read his memoir All Will Be Well, and I also have his collected stories. But to me, there was something so revolutionary about reading Amongst Women, just reminding me of how simple prose can be. I really mean it when I say Amongst Women is probably one of the most straightforward books I've ever read. Simply put, it's about this man named Moran who lives in Ireland, and he's very resentful, or at least very willfully bitter about how his children are growing up and especially leaving him. And the relationship between Morin and his children is so endearing to me because I feel like the children really express that sort of feeling of acknowledging the respect they have for where they grew up, but at the same time wanting to flee and go away to newer opportunities that they know is better for them. And I think because of Morin's sort of qualities that don't really translate well to them, where he comes off so horrible, I think at the same time they acknowledge that they've been passed on those qualities. Their overall theme, I would say, of Amongst Women is definitely this feeling of compromise and sort of how to really settle on that. And it's really interesting because with Morin, towards the end of the book, he talks about being around women, and maybe the greatest opposition for him is, since he sees himself so much as this man, how the complete opposite of him to himself would be a woman, even though he raises girls. And I already briefly mentioned, but again, with reading McGahern's memoir, All Will Be Well, I think this was great to read after Amongst Women because it felt like a really supplemental text. It was still very well written, and I thought in some parts it was very beautiful, but really I think this provides so much context that's essential to appreciating Amongst Women more, because it does talk about McGahern's personal experience as a child, grieving his mother, even a very intimate conversation he had with her about her preparing him for her death. I think it's also really apparent that McGahern's father is based on Morin and Amongst Women, just with how manipulative and bitter he is, especially after his mother's passing. And there's a quote I want to read from here that I think really describes that struggle of being young and understanding that the world can sometimes be so unfavorable to you. We grow into an understanding of the world gradually. Much of what we come to know is far from comforting, that each day brings us closer to the inevitable hour when all will be darkness again. But even that knowledge is power, and all understanding is joy, even in the face of dread, and cannot be taken from us until everything is. We grow into a love of the world, a love that is all the more precious and poignant because the great glory of which we are, but a particle, is lost almost as soon as it is gathered. And finally, the last book I want to talk about today is A Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. This novel explores the 1970s gay scene in New York City as it follows a character by the name of Malone as he goes away or moves from rural Ohio to the city itself. From there, Malone meets Sutherland, who's also a part of the gay scene but primarily already established within New York City, so Sutherland sort of shows Malone what the world offers that he's been waiting for. This book is certainly, I would say, provocative because so much of it explores sex and drugs while in the city, and I think it's interesting because I think Holleran uses this as sort of a gatekeeping tool of sort of understanding that so much of, at least probably maybe, gay culture of that time that's been such an introduction to that scene for a lot of people exploring their sexuality. And I think to push yourself further and dive deeper into going past that sort of gatekeeping part, I think is to really sort of touch on maybe how we use storytelling as a way to sustain gay culture and offer representation. So the sex and drugs is certainly a newness for Malone to explore outside of Ohio, but I think for him, he puts himself sort of on this scale where the sex and drugs are on one side, and then his experience could fall anywhere in between. And I think by doing that, it kind of works like a reset for him to where he can sort of explore partners and also understand sort of what he's looking for realistically. Although we know ultimately he mentions to us that he's looking for love. But as all of this sort of accrual of maybe things like daydreams and yearning for sort of all of these opportunities that Malone's been thinking about for so long, it sort of becomes really complex about he might sort of consider the performative quality of what it means to be a gay person and what it means to be in a relationship with someone else. We know pretty quickly that Malone is very attractive physically, and other men also notice this, so it's pretty easy for Malone to sort of experiment and find out more about himself through his partners. But it becomes really complex whenever you are in the dating scene where you have your own subjective opinion about what it means to confront your own sexuality versus someone else also going against the sort of heteronormative values of the world and especially in the 1970s, what the world only deems as the only sort of lifestyle you can attain. One example of this is that Malone does form a relationship with a man named Frankie, although that does fall apart, and I think it shows that by not putting sort of your idealism on a pedestal, it can sort of not make you feel like you have to prepare for always only ever staying in that one relationship you managed to get in the first place. Although then I feel like it does sort of emphasize or sort of create these binaries where on one hand you have this purgatory of sex and partying, so the opposition of that would be finding yourself in a relationship, or at least finding that you even admit that you want to be in one. So even that, I think, becomes problematic because, as Malone explains, he does find out that people within the gay community are committing suicide. And then Malone even manages to think to himself something like, man, if I only just slept with that one person and had sex with them, then maybe they wouldn't have killed themselves. So it becomes an endless cycle where you feel responsible for the actions of people within the same community as you, and then you feel guilty for maybe not living the best quality of life that other people want and try to reach for. I think overall Andrew Holleran does a great job at combating the assumptions about gay life and gay people in a work, especially as early as this one. And I think it's really important to remember that the sort of premise of Dancer from the Dance is that it does come from the subjective experiences and the storytelling nature of passing down what this culture means and how to sort of keep it alive. So those are all the books for round 1 of my summer wrap-up. So if you've read any of these, I would love to know what you think, and I will probably see you next week for part 2. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.